And I'm going to show you a graph that Jamie Dimon put in the 2015 annual report of JP Morgan.
Okay.
It's a really interesting graph, and by the way, it's fantastic reading his letters. It's a crash course on banking and lending. I just want to show you that graph and get your thoughts on it, and it's to this point of how do we see the banking space and the lending space over time in India, and how it can consolidate. I'm just going to pull it up for you.
Sure.
So if you see this graph, and of course I'll have it as a display for everyone who's watching. It's interesting that you look at the numbers. So in a lot of the developed nations around the world, over time there's tremendous consolidation of banking assets among the top, depending on which country, 2, 3, 4, 5 banks. Do you think that we are on course to have a similar experience in India, and that over time there will always be a large number of banks, but the concentration of assets will increase dramatically over time in India?
So look, I think the chart that you've shown, right, it arises from the regulator's incentives. The regulator really has no upside here. So regulator is not going to get a bonus if 5 new banks come in and their assets burgeon, right? But if there is a blow up, if even a chota bank blows up, the regulator will get pilloried in the media, the public will have a go at the regulator, right? So the world over, including in a communist country like China, the regulator tends to be super risk averse, especially if it's a fast growing, high profile economy. The regulator tends to be petrified of bank failures. Now, if you're a regulator and you're petrified of bank failures, what do? You make it very hard for new banks to enter. And if you make it very hard for new banks to enter, then obviously amongst the incumbents, the most competent hoover up the market share, right? And that's exactly why a JP Morgan and a Wells Fargo are as dominant as they are in America. It's why, say, a bank like HSBC or Lloyds Bank are as dominant as they are in the UK. And similarly in China, ICBC and the government-owned banks will have 40-50% market share. The top few banks in China will have the 40-50% market share you're showing. So my reckoning is India will go like that, unless the RBI suddenly becomes very brave and decides to let in every year half a dozen banks, which I simply don't see happening. Unless the RBI decides to let in half a dozen banks, or the powers that be in Delhi make a call that we will allow industrial houses to come into banking, which also I think is going to be a super controversial call. So unless the powers that be in Delhi or the RBI makes a sea change in the regulatory construct, I think consolidation in banking continues. At a very straightforward level, whether it's HDFC Bank or indeed our investment in, say, Kotak Bank. In some of our funds, we also have ICICI and Axis. The reason we want to be invested with the best private sector banks is, given that there is barriers to entry, the incumbents have 3 very powerful competitive advantages. They are getting liabilities at incredibly low costs, even in the latest quarter. If you see HDFC Bank or ICICI Bank's cost of liability, it's something like, I think, 4.6, 4.7, right, on average, right, between CASA and the wholesale market piece. They're basically paying sub 5% for their cost of funds, and they're lending that money out at 7-8%, right? At even for premium customers, they're lending that money out at 7-8%. Second advantage that a high quality private sector bank will have is, given that they have mountains of data to analyze, applying modern data analysis techniques, applying AI gives them privileged insights onto who are the best credits in the country, right? The more data you have, the more powerful your data mining insights, right? So yes, Federal Bank will have good insights from data mining, but given that HDFC Bank is 4-5x the size of Federal Bank, their insights from data mining will be exponentially better, right? And the third benefit, I think, is this whole new regime around account aggregation. I think it suits the larger lenders far more than it suits the smaller lender. The larger lenders, my senses, are pinging away using the account aggregation regime, getting customers, prospective customers, to share their bank statement details. So you might not be a ICICI Bank customer, you might be, say, an SBI customer. But under the account aggregation regime, ICICI Bank will request you to share your SBI account details. And if ICICI Bank or HDFC Bank is the most proactive amongst the private sector banks, their ability to sign up new customers using the account aggregator regime is disproportionately greater compared to, say, a PSU bank. So I think the regulatory regime fosters profit consolidation across the world if the banking regulator is risk averse. And as I said, there is no reason for the risk regulator to be anything other than risk averse. In fact, they have a posh name for this. It's called prudential regulation.
One way of playing that is simply just buying the largest banks and banking on the fact that they will keep growing and sort of get a larger share of the pie. Could you also make the case that there is value to buying well-run small banks under the assumption that over time they will be swallowed up and full value will be realized as the larger guys swallow them up?
So there is value to buying smaller banks, but perhaps not for the reasons you mentioned, Krish. So here is why the line of thought you gave, right, is somewhat counterintuitive to me. If a small bank agrees to be swallowed up, it's usually when it's struggling, right? So very rarely will a successful, thriving small bank allow a larger bank to gobble it up, right? So if you go back all the way back to, I think, 2009 or 8, Bank of Rajasthan was taken over by ICICI. Basically, the RBI orchestrated that marriage between Bank of Rajasthan and ICICI Bank, right? Bank of Rajasthan ran into some issues and so on, right? So therefore, to invest in a small bank and say, well, one day it'll get swallowed up, that's basically saying this guy will get into trouble and then he'll be bailed out of trouble, right? So Yes Bank was bailed out by SBI, but I think shareholders pretty much lost everything they had. I reckon a better reason for buying smaller banks is we're a very heterogeneous country, we're a diverse country, and there are deep pockets of regional wealth where the regional elite have affiliations to a local bank rather than to a national brand name like a SBI or an HDFC Bank, right? So for example, again, in our small cap portfolio, we have City Union Bank, right? So I've known these folks for a long time. They're a 110-year-old bank, specifically focused around Tamil Nadu, Andhra, Telangana, and the elite in that part of the world, affluent people, have deep affinity for City Union Bank, right? So I've met lots of private sector bankers who try to poach customers from City Union Bank, and they could be offering interest rates 200, 300 bips better than what CUBK is offering, but the customer stays loyal to CUBK, right? So when you see a regional franchise like that, provided they are keeping up with the times on technology, provided they've got a good management team, to my mind, it makes sense to lock into that, especially if it's a industrially, economically booming part of the country like Telangana, Andhra, Tamil Nadu is, right? So we bought City Union Bank, I think at 1.1 times or 1.2 times price to book. Their tier 1 ratio is 17-18%, ROEs are 14-15%. As I said, very loyal client base, and they've upgraded the technology, perhaps a little later than they should have, but they've upgraded the technology where they're now signing off on loans in 2 hours rather than 10 days, right? So yes, regional banks make sense, provided they have a very regionally loyal client base, which is sticky, which gives them a competitive advantage.